Yeah, we're here to talk about the work that came about throughout this week in asynchronous streams. Myself, James Melsom, and the other cluster champions, Alexandre Dubor, Luis Fruguada, and Felipe Passaguero, were very keen when we found out also about the theme for this year's conference. The idea of uncertainty, we really wanted to make, say, a cornerstone of the project. And I think in this regard, we definitely succeeded. Unfortunately, Felipe and Luis were literally unable to attend, at least physically. But Luis managed to stream in 24 hours a day for 4 days of the week. Even this morning, we're still sending in files. So also in the spirit of the cluster, really managed to make a massive contribution. And I'd really like to thank at this point the participation and the input of all of the collaborators. We really worked as a team throughout this, so we won't so much talk about the individual outputs, but rather we organized ourselves in two main groups. So the cluster itself was based on the somewhat simply described premise of combining moving and static sensory data in the urban realm, and combining this with visual data in order to create a synergy between the way that a microclimate functions and perhaps a better understanding of how this actually can be understood also by everyday users of public space. It comes as an extension of a previous research which Luis and I presented at Arcadia in October in San Francisco, in which, in this case, we scanned an area of an urban area in Zurich and generated a three-dimensional kind of voxel space idea of how this microclimate functioned under various circumstances. And this idea of the motion of the sensors became a cornerstone of this work. So the project itself, I've got two videos playing. Let's see how we go. Good. So the project itself really took as inspiration the background of London. You could say this quite light-hearted idea of incorporating this history of the balloons above London, and also in regards to public space and in regards to landscape architecture, which is should we say, the main frame in which the project was set, really took on or incorporated the parks of Regent's Park and Primrose Hill as epitomizing public space which has to be incredibly flexible. So in these parks, here we see Marylebone Green, which is used for everything from rugby games through to kind of estate parties and so on. Through to the main uses we saw, which was school kids playing. So within this framework of a park which has a multitude of uses, it was the perfect testing ground to really understand this space and how it functions. It looks like we've got a screensaver running in the background. So the project literally began with this tour to the site. You saw this walk through the city to the Marylebone Green in Regent's Park. And there we did one flight with the balloon as a whole group and looked literally at how it performed. We had very high winds this week. So this was the second day when we got out, so the Tuesday, when the helium tanks finally had an attachment so that we could actually fill a balloon. And we made the main photogrammetric study of the site. So this is when the group first started to split. So here you see the work of David and Dimitri starting to look at how they can actually codify this GPS captured camera data and actually start to build up this and incorporate it with the photogrammetric model of the park, which was generated from below. Here you see the group and various views which were used to construct this model. And this work, here you see a further development through the week of this, where they could actually start to pull back individual images. They could look at even which way the camera was moving, where the balloon was at its most stable, where it was banking and turning, and we could start to get an idea how it would perform. This was quite important because at this point in the project we also left it really up to the participants to also start to think about how we would tether these balloons based on the wind results, based on the local conditions, the strategy to actually get them stable in the air and to get the best possible results. So at this point we had also to a great degree Louis chiming in, this voice which would appear from somebody's laptop on how to deal with this tracking situation. So abstract from the photogrammetry, which is somehow a way of first getting a understanding of the site and developing a strategy, we now start the sensing process. So that means literally moving and static sensors which are sending information into a database which is also being fed by imagery of the same moving balloons. So by tracking and streaming this data over 3G, we could literally separate into the away team or fieldwork team and the headquarters, if you like, data headquarters, where all of the data was being already analyzed and first attempts were being made to visualize and incorporate the data. Here you see Louis via Skype looking at tracking possibilities, the frames which are coming back, in which we had to also adjust to the 3G connection, the speed of the data retrieval in order to get the best possible frame rate and to get as close to, shall we say, real-time data capture as possible. So these last two examples, perhaps I can show that last slide. Here we see, for example, the micro movement, you could say, of the balloons. What was interesting for us here is that by using the video capture, which would seem perhaps quite not the most obvious way to link these balloons, we could take very precise GPS coordinates of the positions of the fastenings on the ground, and then using the video capture we could actually get much more subtle movements which would be entirely lost in a much more widely spaced GPS model. It also meant that we could have many more nodes without having to invest, shall we say, in what is a very expensive sensor, which is the GPS. And here you see, just for comparison, this is the much larger scale model from the previously made photogrammetry set, which is much more suited to the larger site. So I will pass on to Alex, who will explain the sensor network.
Thank you. So as it explained, we tried to go for a cheap sensor, also because maybe we don't want to spend so much money, but the main target was to be able to multiply this sensor over the environment and being able to map as much space as we can. We come with two different sensors. We started with the G-Node. G-Node is an Arduino-based electronics with a RFID sender, so you can communicate through waves and receive it directly on your computer. We try to attach sensors that are with understandable values. So we use light that can be in lux. We use also temperature and humidity, so percentage in degrees Celsius, and we use also sound sensors that was able to give us value in dB. This kit is really cheap, I think around 50 euros, quite light, but we put a really heavy battery. We're a bit scared about the battery, but this is like now 2 weeks that is running, and still doesn't have problem with that. The idea will be that evidently we could map also a space with much more time, so many with a long time, and I'm quite happy about the result of this one. This one was the one we attached to the balloon and being able to get some data in the space. We also worked with another type of sensors that we call Smart Citizen kit. It's something that we developed. Another type of sensor that is the Smart Citizen kit is electronic that have been developed in Fab Lab Barcelona and with Angar as well. And basically you have more or less the same sensors. You have on top of that the gas, two gas sensors to get a bit of NO2 and CO. And the point about this is more accessible sensors. This one you have still to hack a bit to get into Arduino, and you need a receiver. This one is really synced to be independent. It's a bit more expensive, but you get the point to be configured once. You can let it somewhere, and we already have a database that is filled with these sensors. As well, the battery can last a bit. But it was quite nice. So we're displaying this one, not displaying, but putting this one on the ground as maybe a comparative value, and we try to map this in a space with this as fixed sensors and this one as mobile sensors. I'll let you speak about the result.
So, well, perhaps we could let actually Luis talk about the results. We've got a little... here you see one of the main modes we were actually working in terms of collaboration. We ended up having massive, this is just a fraction of the number of members of this Google Hangout, discussing how we could actually visualize and in real time interact with this database. And Luis himself actually really got into the spirit somehow of this, oh, we're not plugged in. Good. So I'll let him say what this meant for the project, shall we say.
An interesting part about this, because we have all this information sort of being collected on this database, really you can access it from anyone. So while James and the participants have been out in the middle of Primrose Hill, I've been sort of also accessing the little laptop that is sort of the command center, and I can see the data coming in. If something needs to be changed in the applications we have that collect the data, I can also kind of tweak that. So it's, while yes, it's been kind of a disadvantage to be over here, it's also been interesting that some of the premises of the cluster have been kind of other things that kind of come out that are interesting, like this ability to the accessibility of the data through the management that we've implemented.
Great. He was also. It's been great to see him also in other projects. We also saw a bit of G-Howl in projections of reality. So he's been somehow very present in this conference in more ways than one. So here you see just a very small example of exactly this raw data which is being tested. And whenever you see, for example, a balloon being taken down and then put back up, this is literally because the voice of Luis came over the database that sensor number 11 has stopped sending. And this is the result which he was then doing blob detection on and looking for the differences and then remapping this to a spatial idea of the position of the sensors at any one point in time. So the database that was chosen was MongoDB. What was interesting about this is we could throw images, all sorts of data, potentially even sound bites in the future, and kind of at any one time be streaming this data. So once the students actually, or the collaborators rather, were beginning to interact with the data, so they would have a concept of how they would want to visualize it. Here you see temperature and humidity at any one point over the site interacting. So you see that humidity literally rescaling the entire mesh, and the 3D information being temperature. And here you see Temu's example of working with these various sensors. It's slightly cropped, so you can't see that he's turning on and off the sensors. And we can see in real time, as the data comes down, what the different values are and how they compare over time. And those can be freeze-framed and overlaid. I think I missed something there. Oh. Whoop. Whoop. So I'll let that just play out. So one of the main aspects of this project was not only to visualize the data, but also to look at the spatial ramifications. It was very interesting, and we really took it to heart, this, some of the things which Usman mentioned in his presentation, where he talked about his final tagline was almost the spectacle of data. I think we would definitely agree with this, but also the main aims out of the whole research line over the last year or so that Luis and this collaboration has been taking place has also been to literally make people aware of the environment around them and how it functions, potentially generating actual scientific data along the way, but also literally bringing people's attention and hopefully shifting within spatial planning this emphasis on the visual spectrum to one which really integrates the invisible side. Thank you very much.
Okay, can we have everyone who's involved in those clusters come to stage, and Ben also, please.
So I'd like to go ahead and open up the first question from the audience to see if anybody in the audience had a question for either the keynote speaker or for the clusters. Stunned silence. Here we go.
So this is a question for the first group and the third group, and it relates to the use of precedent in your work. And I was thinking about in the third group when you were using the balloons to look at sound, there was a great experiment done by Sharon's acoustician where they used balloons to try to determine what free field sound really was. And of course there's a tremendous amount of work done with a whole variety of different types of weather balloons. And so I was wondering whether it was more important to you all to get the experience of working with the balloons and collecting data, or really whether that was just a vehicle for you to develop a way of visualizing that type of environmental data. And that relates to my question for the first group, which is a little bit different in the way that one might think about precedent, but I think they're following the same trajectory. The urban topological map is almost identical to the one that Hiroshi Ishii and his Tangible Media group did probably a little over 10 years ago. And then it's been well worked on by the visualization group at RPI Computer Science, who've added a lot of the attributes to it. So I was also trying to understand, was that an intention to develop a new type of interface or information environment, or were you all also interested in getting into and understanding the topology of the urban environment as well? So I'm not sure whether one thing is whether the precedent is meant just to be a vehicle or whether it's actually something you're trying to strive toward.
Yes, I would say it's definitely a combination of the two. I mean, you saw by this view over London from 1945, I believe, that, or slightly earlier, that it was very much in the spirit of the project. It was really kind of a generative idea. But through that process of these months of discussion, we actually found a huge number of reasons why this added enormous depth to the project. This ability of the, for example, visual tracking literally came straight out of what we detected, the behavior of the balloon that we detected over the skies of Basel in this case, where we could really see these very subtle movements, which of course GPS would lose, and we really wanted to get to capture all of that data in terms of how it potentially could even show wind direction, gusting, fluctuations, even height variations. It was a fascinating vehicle in this sense. In terms of historical precedent, we wanted to really think of them as a network, and the idea of relating it to fixed sensors as a way of even seeing synergies between, for example, fixed sensors on buildings, which are a perfect carrier for sensors, of course, and then populating the rest of a spatial region with other types of flying objects. in this case, not only silent, so you get fantastic sound results, but also this amazing lifespan in the air. And the other aspect, which I'll just finish with, is literally the reaction of the public, which especially in Primrose Hill was incredible. One of the participants found photographs of us on Instagram. Literally, we had children coming and saying, "What are you doing? What do you mean microclimate? What is that?" You know, and so on. So this idea of spectacle, I think, really, literally generated a visual understanding of microclimate. Yeah. And to the first group.
Does the other team want to say anything? Projections?
Okay. I think it's a good question. For us, I think it was both, as a group of cluster champions, when we set the whole thing up, it was about understanding, or rather, we were coming from different angles in practice. So we had both academics and people from design offices, and I think it was trying to understand what we can do with the tools and skills that we've got. And I think, as Richard said, we may have sort of reinvented the wheel with some aspects, but I think that was sort of part of the journey of how we can use the tools that everybody in the cluster was familiar with, how we can implement something or create a workflow that we thought has a sort of direct application to our professional lives.
Yeah, it's that's very loud. I have a technical question about those of you that have used the sensors. The sensors all report back to one computer, right, on the bottom floor, or did you ever think about using a sensor network so that also each sensor of the balloons, they have a communication between each other?
Hello? Yeah. I think there have been already a nice example recently. We've seen this quadricopters network sharing their Wi-Fi to create a network over the city. And this is a possibility that we can explore in the sensors. One of this one was working on RFID, so one of the technology. The other one was working on Wi-Fi. Technically, we get some problem with that because Arduino, for example, the Smart Citizen Kit, we get some problem of the library for the Wi-Fi doesn't fit inside an Arduino, so you have to go for other technology. But I think it's possible. We just try to reduce the price and also the complexity to try to, in some case, reach a greater audience, or also to cover a larger area.
Anyone else? From the stage?
Can I?
No.
Can I ask a question to the sensor people?
One more. We'll let Flora go first, and then you're next.
Okay, I have a question for Ben. I really enjoy your talk. Thank you. And I'm actually I really agree with your paradigm for cities as platform, and I like that term, environment programming interface. And my question is simple. I just want to know, who do you think should be the driver or the enabler of this? And I guess, you know, if you put the analogy of multiplayer online game, then who will be the moderator of that game?
Yeah, I think that is probably the most important question, because that's really how does the discourse advance unless someone's driving it. And that's kind of what I was saying before, though, is that I feel like there are a number of actors that could be the driver, and I believe that there is sort of a tsunami wall of Silicon Valley industry that's sort of approaching the built environment right now, and it will be the driver unless people in the built environment industry respond to that before it arrives. Google, is on its way, I guess, is probably the short story. And so, those actors will be the drivers of the discourse, if not the realization of this type of platform. But the question is, is there a coherent response from structural engineering, from architecture that begins to consider this. So I think it's really, it's sort of in the hands of the studios at the moment to articulate, a coherent possibility around this right now, but it is a rather technical problem from a networking perspective. So, these may not be skills that are resident, in a lot of these firms yet. So I would say probably I would imagine that structural engineering would be at the core of this, because there is already kind of an MEP, the promise of doing hardware installation or at least planning for hardware installation in the built environment, which is going to be a huge part of how this thing unfolds. So that would be my guess right now, but it's kind of, I think, anybody's game at the moment.
From the stage? Go ahead.
Yep. I guess it's a question for the balloon sensors. You were, intensely studying a local area microclimate. I just want to know, did you get much variation in the results? You had the balloons all in one area. Yeah. Did it actually give you a distribution of results, or was it all very similar?
It was actually, I would say, surprisingly varied. As I may have mentioned briefly, the wind speeds this week were way beyond expectations. This is where perhaps trusting data that you find on the internet is really an example of the danger of this. But to put it in context, I mean, what was interesting was the readings were remarkably consistent. I would say that in certain areas it would depend on each sensor. I couldn't really across the board say that there were huge variations in all of them. You saw also in the visualization of Temu that you have somehow a line which is almost not responding at all. So you see a big difference between the sensors, and that's why we also tried to push to integrate these. So rather than looking at heat on its own, what could be the relationship between them? In this case, somehow the fact that these balloons were constantly in movement, and that we had this mapping which actually came on as a layer over the data, as in this case Luis solved that issue. So as soon as the movement came into the database, we actually saw a much more interesting kind of data mapping coming out of it. And indeed the variation was I would say within, say, up to 5 degrees. And that was also because we could be out there. In this case, I believe we were out there on Wednesday for literally 4 hours constantly streaming data. So that was really a great data set. If you just compare it back to this first pilot project of flying a drone over the campus near the ETH with the Masters of Landscape students running around on the ground level, there we had maybe a 20-minute flight time maximum per battery, and then you need to come down and you need to put it back up. Helicopter has, a standard helicopter has maybe 10 minutes, at least in the current technology, but it was a huge bonus to have this massive streaming, almost unending, should I say, stream of data. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
It's for Ben. My question is, in your presentation you kind of said that what I got from it was that the space will kind of become very personal according to the users. And I was thinking also about yesterday's talk with Usman about that buffer zone between what I want and what the system wants. So are you imagining systems of the users, is the preference of the user going to be something very personal, or maybe like an alias? So it's the discussion of glove kind of between myself and the system, or do I have a split individuality, like a second life, or is it something that caters directly to what I want at that moment, or the system interprets it?
I mean, I think questions of digital identity are both, online and offline, are extremely complicated. I mean, the idea that you might not want to be expressing your own sort of desires in public space is, the ability to mediate that is probably something we're going to begin to resolve in online applications before we even start tackling it in public space, or at least we're going to be confronted with that concern. We already are, this whole Facebook kind of exposure. But I think that the real question is, how does one build? I mean, part of these systems will have to, and part of what, I have a foundation in Amsterdam which explores computing in public spaces, and part of it is about, what happens if you have these discoverable services in the environment like projection or audio in, say, a public square. Who decides what happens there, right? And that's like, that type of provisioning is about, that really is a legal framework in a way of like who gets to say. But there is also a solution which involves more computing, right? This idea of doing kind of a map reduce or a sort of a collaborative recommendation that finds some middle ground in the data set that's represented by the tastes of all the participants simultaneously is also something that happens in some online environments already, and so that you could imagine that carrying over to real space. But those are definitely, I think those are all different modalities that you sort of have to imagine that these spaces will go into. But I think a lot of that has to do with our conception of what publics are and what private is, and how what our spheres of control are in those various environments. So, but I do think that a lot of those things will come more consciously into question. I think people just have assumptions right now. They don't really think about it. You go into a mall and you're hearing some elevator music that's just kind of ambient, and you don't really feel as though you might even have a choice about that. But there might become a time where you start to wonder, why is this not my music that's playing, or music that people in this environment would have chosen? So there's definitely a transformation of those sensibilities, I think, coming.
Okay, we are running a little bit late. So I'd first of all just like to thank Ben and all of the participants of these 3 clusters. So thank you very much. And